Right. Good evening, everyone. I'm sure there are still lots of people who are on their way, but it's lovely to see such a great turnout on a Thursday evening. Also, welcome to everyone who's joining us online. We can't see you, but we're really, really pleased that you're able to take part in this event, especially since this is the third stop on the tour for Picturing the Invisible. So we're very mindful that there are people all over the world who have an interest in some of the subjects that are being discussed, as well as in the artwork that is in the exhibition. In March last year, just under a year ago, I received an email from a certain Dr. Makoto Takahashi asking if we might be interested in an exhibition he had curated in the memory of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Hockney's Eye had just opened at the Hyun Gallery, and David Hockney's views on photography had become part of my curatorial spiel. In particular, his idea that, I quote, "There's nothing wrong with photography if you don't mind the perspective of a paralyzed cyclops." Hockney's skepticism about photography's ability to depict seeing as we experience it was fresh in my mind when I received Mac's email about a photography exhibition about Fukushima 2011. One look at the Picturing the Invisible online exhibition, of course, disabused me of my received wisdom. Ionizing radiation, like the kind produced in nuclear fission and chain reactions, and all of those terms that we don't quite understand but are fearful of. We know that ionizing radiation is at the invisible end of a spectrum that includes visible light. All seeing is simply the interaction of light and the biological mechanisms that receive and interpret it. And the artists in this exhibition have helped us see the lingering, invisible, radiant energy of a nuclear disaster. Leigh Koshiga's Mysterious Spirals and The Man Pierced by a Tree, both taken before the triple disaster of March 2011, have transformed into sinister portents for what was about to come. In Yoi Kawakubo's exposed film works, nuclear fallout is the invisible hand that has caused the images to form. At the safer end of the light spectrum, Giles Price's infrared photographs are equally revealing of the limitations of human vision. The thermal camera sees the heat of bodies, intensified by stress and fever, in a way that our eyes cannot perceive. This exhibition really does picture the invisible, and in doing so, it empowers all of us to think about our own futures in this nuclear age. Now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Makoto Takahashi, who conducted his doctoral studies on Fukushima right here at the University of Cambridge, and has recently returned from a stint as a Fulbright Lloyds Fellow at the Programme for Science, Technology and Society, I like that, at the Harvard Kennedy School. Over to you, Mac.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Perona. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It falls upon me to welcome you to this launch event for Picturing the Invisible. As you've heard, this is a travelling exhibition that was organised in memory of the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake, tsunami and nuclear disaster. On the 11th of March 2011, Japan was struck by an earthquake so powerful that it moved the very axis of the Earth more than 10 centimetres and shook the Japanese nation to its core. It was followed by a tsunami that reached heights of 40 feet and swept entire buildings away. But the crisis still was not over. The wave had knocked out cooling systems at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, causing a triple meltdown. Japan was now the site of the worst nuclear disaster the world had seen since Chernobyl. then Prime Minister Naoto Kan was surely right when he claimed that it was the most severe crisis that Japan has faced since World War II. More than a decade on, Picturing the Invisible brings together 9 talented artists, all working with film and photography, but often in very creative ways, to examine the lingering legacies of Japan's triple disaster. Their art makes visible the legacies of what is widely called 3/11, the ghostly touch of radiation, lingering traumas, and the resilience of those communities rebuilding their lives in its wake. And to place these works in their context, each artwork has been paired with an essay by a policymaker, an academic, an activist, or an author, all united by a deep engagement with either this disaster specifically or nuclear matters more generally. As you've heard from Perona, it is a travelling exhibition. A smaller version of the show was first shown at the Royal Geographical Society in London in 2021. It then travelled to Munich in 2022, and it's now here in its best and biggest form at the Hyun Gallery. And so I think this would be a perfect moment for me to express my deep gratitude to Downing College and to the Hyun Gallery, to Perona, and also to the curatorial assistant, Simona, for agreeing to host the show and for their work in helping get it on the walls. Of course, I should also thank the AHRC and the Great British Sasakawa Foundation, without whose generous support this exhibition would not have been possible. Perona, of course, also mentioned that the work and the curation is very much grounded in my time as a PhD student here in Cambridge. I was just across the road. I wasn't at Downing, but please don't hold that against me. I was at Emmanuel. But I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my supervisor, Alex Jeffrey, my director of studies, Phil Howe, but also Ash Amin and Michael Bravo, who is at Downing. So that's in the plus column for him, whose lectures introduced me to many of the ideas that have helped inform my curation. And of course, my final thanks before I get back to the exhibition and stop thanking people goes to my partner, Magdalene Connolly, without whom none of the projects that I work on would be possible. So, back to the exhibition. We're gathered here tonight to ask what it means to remember the Fukushima disaster in the UK today, at a time of COVID-19, climate crisis, and war in Ukraine. And in a minute, I'll hand you over to our very distinguished panel, but I'd like to just get the discussion rolling with 2 brief answers of my own. And the first is to say that the disaster, although it started more than a decade ago, is still very much not over. A decade on from 2011, Japan faced another crisis in the form of a global pandemic. Yet even as Japan grappled with the challenges of COVID-19, the struggle to rebuild the Tohoku region continued. Even today, hundreds of workers are at the Fukushima Daiichi plant working to decommission it, a task that is expected to take at least another 30 years and $96 billion. Thousands more work to decontaminate the surrounding countryside. For even today, vast swathes of land remain uninhabitable. Tens of thousands of people remain unable to return to their homes, and many more choose not to, concerned that life in Fukushima may not be as safe as the Japanese state claims. For even today, trust in the Japanese state and its experts remains bruised. The confusion caused by poor crisis communication is still fresh in Japan's collective memory. So too are the findings of independent investigations, which concluded that this was a crisis made in Japan, one which had its roots in a culture of cozy collusion between government, industry, and regulators, often imagined as forming a nuclear village. So the 3/11 crisis is long since over, but the disaster is still with us today. But the other way in which I think the disaster is still with us is the way in which it speaks to current events. And in the brief time that this exhibition has been travelling from the UK to Germany and then back to the UK, current events have continued to imbue the exhibition with new meanings. Of course, in the last year, nuclear matters have never been far from our headlines. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of Chernobyl and Zaporizhia fanned nuclear fears. Both nuclear disaster and even nuclear exchange have felt more probable in the last year than at any time, at least in my lifetime. At the same time, the war in Ukraine also revealed Europe's dependency on imports of Russian gas. In Germany, where I work now at TU Munich, the invasion of Ukraine prompted many to question the wisdom of Germany's nuclear moratorium, which had been triggered by the disaster in Japan. But Picturing the Invisible is also an exhibition that was planned and has been delivered in times of COVID. So while its subject is very much the nuclear, it's also implicitly a response to pandemic times. And I very much felt called to initiate it in two ways by the pandemic. The first was as a researcher. I've spent much of the last 10 years of my life, in fact, pretty much my whole adult life, working on the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. It was the subject of my undergraduate thesis before I went on to a PhD. I found out about the disaster one slightly bleary-eyed morning where I woke up tired and perhaps slightly hungover, popped into Savino's, which I'm sure many of you have enjoyed, and saw the rather horrifying news on their TV set. And I can assure you that woke me up more than any cup of coffee could have. And I knew that many of the people that over the next however many years I would spend my time interviewing were eagerly looking forward to the 10-year anniversary and also the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, anticipating the global coverage that they thought this was going to bring to their continuing struggles. Of course, none of this was to be due to COVID. The so-called Recovery Olympics very quickly became the COVID Olympics. But the other way in which COVID made this exhibition feel urgent was in my role as a teacher at TU Munich. I was very aware that COVID-19 was robbing students of so much of their normal university experience, and I wanted to offer my students something extra. So to that end, the planning and curation of this exhibition has been integrated into a course at TU Munich, and students have been involved at every stage. And indeed, if you go to our website, you can see some of our students' essays. And I should, of course, shout out the fact that two of the students have travelled over from Munich to join us today. And one of the things that the students really brought to the exhibition was emphasising the ways in which COVID-19 might offer an opportunity to communicate the realities of life in Fukushima to foreign audiences. After all, we now all know what it's like to have an invisible danger all around you, to have normally prosaic choices transformed into a negotiation with an unseen and unfamiliar risk. In that sense, we've all done our fair share of picturing and understanding the invisible. So I think I've talked far too long already. You want to hear from our wonderful panel. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming the panelists. No, I should introduce them first, and then you can all join me in welcoming them. That makes more sense. So we have four wonderful panelists tonight. Yoi Kawakubo is an artist who buries a large format film in the contaminated soils of Fukushima's exclusion zone to produce a powerful series of abstracts titled If the Radiance of 1,000 Suns Were to Burst into the Skies at Once. He's been exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, the Ashmolean in Oxford, and the National Arts Centre, also in Tokyo, among many other venues. And among the accolades that he has accrued are the 2015 Ohara Museum of Art Prize, and he was shortlisted for the 2016 Shiseido Egg Prize. Next to him is Giles Price, a photographer who uses thermal technology to render eerie everyday scenes in Namie and Iitate, two towns heavily exposed to the effects of the nuclear disaster. In so doing, his restricted residence series evokes the ghostly presence of radiation, which has deterred so many residents from returning to their homes, even now that many evacuation orders have been lifted. Price's work has been exhibited at the Photographers Gallery at the National Portrait Gallery and the Imperial War Museum, among many other venues. Moving along, we have Dr. Brigitte Steger, who is an associate professor in modern Japanese studies here at the University of Cambridge, and the co-editor of Japan Copes with Calamity. She is one of the essayists involved in Picturing the Invisible, and also, of course, a Downing Fellow. The tsunami of March 2011 prompted her to travel to northeast Japan, where she was the only researcher to live alongside survivors in a shelter. She observed that problems with cleanliness became a symbol of shared suffering in the shelters, and that survivors tried to regain a sense of normality by organising household routines according to deeply rooted social structures. And last but not least, we're delighted to be joined by Leigh Turner, who is a writer and former British ambassador to both Ukraine and Austria, as well as a Downing alumnus. His diplomatic career took him to Vienna twice, Moscow, Berlin, Kyiv, and Istanbul. That journey and his hitchhiking through 27 US states in 1979 has inspired his book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to Diplomacy, which is out in April. In Berlin, Leigh took 4 years off diplomacy to look after his children and became a travel writer for the Financial Times. His books include Berlin thriller Blood Summit, his Istanbul thriller Palladium, and his darkly comic 7 Hotels Stories. I'll hope you will all join me in very warmly welcoming our panelists. So, as you all know, the theme of tonight's panel is what does it mean to remember the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in the UK today at a time of COVID, climate crisis, and war in Ukraine. And just to give you a general sense of how we'll go, we'll give each of the panelists a few minutes to respond as they choose. I'll ask a few follow-up questions, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So perhaps, Yoi, we can start with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's 12 years since Fukushima. You have really described well the situation in Japan at that time. I was also living there. And I remember that there was a sense of a very quiet panic in Japan where people didn't know what to do, how to help. People wanted to help, but also didn't know what to do. And also, it was the same for artists. So as an artist, I was usually making artworks based on photography, film, installations, but at the same time, then you start questioning, does this really help people when they're in a position that they are, in a life or death situation? And then a lot of artists travel to the zone. Sometimes some people just to help, cleaning, because the tsunami really took many houses and things from the sea to the land and from the land to the sea. So there was a lot of work needed. So some people did that. My wife was a practicing doctor at the time, so she went right there with a convoy of doctors. But I felt like, I don't know, how can I help? I didn't know what to do. So then a few years later, I was in an artist in residency, and the events took me to travel to the zone, to inside the restriction zone. And at that time, I realized that art probably has a different time frame compared to journalism, to medicine. So there are different time scales. And at that time, because journalism is quite fast in some ways, fast in producing, reacting, and also in moving forward to the next thing. So I just realized that in 3 years, people had started to forget that kind of social anxiety that was prevalent in the society at that time. So I thought maybe I need to work in a different time scale, and started documenting from that time. And also looking at the time frame, I realized at that time that level 7 in accidents, nuclear accidents in this international nuclear scale, there are only 3 or 4. Fukushima, before that we had Chernobyl, we have 3 Mile Island as well. So they happen to be in an interval of around 25 to 30 years, and I thought, then maybe there's some rule or something back there. So I started researching about the price of uranium and other things, and thought maybe it's possible that there is a generational or some kind of theory, and thought that perhaps in 2030, around 2030, might be another somewhere. So in that sense, I think we are now just in the midpoint of this 25 years, well, if there is a periodicity. So I think it's quite important that we keep that in mind, because otherwise it might come again. So I think that sense, it's pretty important that we have that in mind.
It's an interesting but worrying take to think of it as very periodical. But yes, certainly.
Hopefully not.
Yes, well, let's hope not. But I know Yoi was also mentioning the social anxiety, which I know is very much a theme of your work, Giles. So
yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, my sort of association reminder now is very much linked to the sort of intangible aspects, which my particular interest within the body of work I made in Fukushima was, the exposure to radiation, and actually how that equated back during the COVID pandemic to us all living with this unseen, potentially existential threat, and how the routines and restrictions placed upon us at that time offered us a sort of window back into what the people of Fukushima had experienced over a much sort of longer time frame. And my own interest in making the work came from my background in the UK military, where I was in 1991, I was in northern Iraq at the end of the Gulf War, and I was exposed to toxins out there, which were the sort of byproduct and residue of weapon systems used by Saddam Hussein that was still present in the environment. And that subsequently led to health consequences, which I now live with for the rest of my life. So that experience informed my interest to go to Fukushima and actually record first-hand accounts with people who'd moved back into the towns and villages very close to the actual reactor. And this was in 2017 when the Japanese government finally got away with the restrictions on the exclusion zones within the proximity to the reactor. And people had started to come back into these towns and villages. And I used thermal, for me, my practice at the time had been looking at different types of image capture systems, and I'm very interested in sort of visual language and the contextualization of visual language in the age we live in, where we live with more and more overload of images that we make and consume. And for me, using thermal, I use it as a metaphor. I use it as a metaphor for things that are hidden and not seen. And all of the people who've moved back in live under the sort of the weight, anxiety of the psychological burden of this environment, which actually has a name called radiophobia. And this is the fear of radiation and what it may or may not do to you. So that was my process for my reasoning behind using thermal technology.
Fantastic. Thank you, Giles. I mean, we should, of course, mention that the terminology of radiophobia has its own incredibly complex politics.
Does indeed,
with,
yes.
Many people pushing back against it because they see it as a way of trying to diminish the actual bodily harms of radiation exposure. But of course, the psychological burden of living in these areas is also incredibly real. There are many suicides that have been linked to exposure and evacuation. And of course, this experience of seeing a risk all around you is certainly a complicated one. And of course, Brigitte, I mean, one of the central themes of your work is all about how people kind of have, through almost like a ritualistic act of cleaning, come to manage that
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I actually experienced Japan very much like Yoi, also in 2011 when I went to Japan on the Downing Keio exchange, and it was all very dark. There was no, of even food shortages, toilet paper and water bottles and so on, and it was everything very dark. And I also felt I have to do something, but I didn't know what to do. So I didn't know anything about disasters. I had not experienced the area as well. So what I could do, I thought, is I go to the area and just talk to people and find out how they make a living, how they try to get a normal life again in a very non-normal situation. And I went as far away from Fukushima and radiation as I could in the north, in Yamada-machi, and I actually had the chance to live in a shelter together with the tsunami survivors and find out how they slept, how they cleaned, how they organized their lives, and how they managed to get on with each other. And these 3/11 disasters are probably the best documented disasters ever. But I think I was the only person a researcher who actually stayed in a shelter. So that allowed me not only to conduct formal interviews, but also observe people and have informal conversations. One of the many insights I gained is that re-establishing routines of cleanliness and orderliness was a central means by which people were able to regain a grip on their lives. It provided structure and a sense of normality, dignity, familiarity, and also emotional security. So in the shelters, people created a sense of community and solidarity by sharing and solving hygiene problems. I witnessed the impact on how people felt after the first bath, after a while, but also in particular the importance of functioning toilets. So if you have lost control over your personal hygiene, it is very difficult to feel in control of your life. And that's one insight that prompted me when in 2020, when the first news came about the coronavirus coming to Europe from East Asia, that I bought huge amounts of toilet paper, and I think I was beating everyone for about a month with the panic buying.
So you're the reason I had to ration.
Yeah. So when Makoto asked me to respond to one of the photographs by Masamichi Kageya and Morisato, I was intrigued because this Kageya creates these images which you will have the opportunity to see afterwards, that the energy emitted by radiation will be visible on specially produced photographic plates. And in this way, the invisible but threatening radiation actually looks very beautiful. And the picture I saw were footprints of women, children, men, and they look like the starry nights of Fukushima, especially just after the disaster when there was no light pollution, and so you could see the stars, what people tell me. But one thing that struck me when I saw this picture is that all these footsteps were so orderly, even though they were escaping. And in my interviews and with the narratives I recorded from people, there was not much orderly life in that way. So my take, the response I had on these pictures was that I used excerpts from the narrative that were related to the footprints and the escape and also the orderliness, and put them together in a collage. And yeah, that's, I hope that you find time to read these responses, and it's in the gallery.
Yes, it really is worth taking the time to read the many wonderful essays that people.
And I really thank the people from Odaka. I must say, I was in Odaka near Fukushima in one of the exclusion zones where people returned. So many of these quotes are actually from people in Fukushima.
And of course, Leigh, you come here with a very different background, very different expertise, and of course, particularly a deep understanding of Ukraine, which feels like it's imbuing the exhibition with a whole different type of relevance. Could you say a few words about what you think it means to engage with this exhibition and remember Fukushima today?
Sure. I was lucky enough to be able to go and have a look at the exhibition this afternoon. And you've got to be a bit careful about this. It's almost like buzzwords. We have Fukushima, terrible disaster. We have Chernobyl, awful disaster. We have COVID-19, from which we're just recovering. We have the war in Ukraine, which we're all worried about. We have even the Turkish earthquake, which we haven't mentioned, but more than 40,000 people dead in Turkey alone. And I was thinking about this, how to understand these things and how to interact with the exhibition. And it struck me that all of these things I've named are, in a way, an interaction between humankind and the natural world. So in Fukushima, you have a country, Japan, famous for its engineering, builds all its skyscrapers to resist earthquakes. Fukushima was built in such a way as to be resistant to a tidal wave of a certain height. And then along comes a bigger tidal wave, which goes over and creates a nuclear disaster, as well as, of course, killing tens of thousands of people. In Chernobyl, human error. Human beings made this Chernobyl power station. Human beings made mistakes and caused a terrible disaster. If we look at COVID-19, I mean, is that man-made or not? We don't know exactly. The FBI has a view on this. China has another view. I don't know if we'll ever know the answer. But again, it's something where the natural world, or maybe some kind of natural disaster, has overcome humankind in a way that we couldn't have foreseen. And then we have Turkish earthquake, a lot of discussion about building standards. To what extent is this the fault of people, or is it the fault of the environment, or some kind of mixture of the two? Or, of course, the Ukraine war. Surely that is completely the work of humankind, that this terrible disaster is happening, and we have the threat of nuclear war hanging over us again, which we can't discount. And in a way, none of these things threaten the world. I mean, the world will get on fine. I was very struck when I visited Chernobyl twice. There's a kind of ghastly disaster tourism that goes on there. You can go and visit the exclusion zone. And I also visited it once to see the new safe confinement, so-called safe confinement being built, which is a big steel shed that goes over the whole thing. And what really struck me about the place is that nature is thriving. If you go to Chernobyl, I mean, when I arrived as ambassador in Kiev, I went into my bathroom in the residence, and there were iodine tablets there, which we were supposed to take if there was another nuclear disaster. So it brought it home to you a bit. And then you go to Chernobyl, and one of the sort of things you do in Chernobyl is to go and look at the cooling ponds. And the cooling ponds are a bit irradiated, and what's down at the bottom nobody quite knows. And they're full of catfish. And your guide, if you have a guide, will buy some loaves of bread and throw the bread into the water, and it boils with these giant catfish, which are 3 meters long, 3 meters plus. And, you think, my God, mutant catfish. But they're not mutant catfish. They're just normal catfish, which nobody is eating. All right? Nobody is going to the cooling ponds to fish for those catfish. Nobody fancies a catfish from the Chernobyl cooling ponds. And so the catfish are thriving. And in the woods around Chernobyl, in the exclusion zone, they teem with wild boar and all sorts of things, which are growing quite happily in this exclusion zone. So in a way, you can be pessimistic and say, look at all these disasters. They are caused by us. We are threatening the existence of humankind on this planet with all these things, with our mistakes, our stupidity. You can also take an optimistic approach and say, actually, many of these things are within our power to do something about them. We can build better nuclear power stations or not build nuclear power stations, depending on your point of view. We can try to stop Russia from using nuclear weapons. We can try to bring about a settlement in Ukraine that won't threaten the entire planet. So it's both a challenge and an opportunity, I thought, in many ways. So that was my response. And yeah, you can actually have lunch in the Chernobyl canteen. I have done that, but not everybody was very hungry.
But I mean, to follow up immediately and take the position of devil's advocate, play the pessimist. You mentioned the war in Ukraine, and it also said, well, many of these things don't threaten our existence. I mean, how do you feel the current situation in Ukraine impacts the probability of nuclear exchange or nuclear use?
Well, maybe I wasn't clear. I wasn't saying it doesn't threaten our existence. I was saying it doesn't threaten the world. The world will get on quite well without humans. I mean, it does threaten humankind, certainly. I mean, this is a big debate, of course. Will Putin use nuclear weapons? My personal view is, for what it's worth, is that it would be completely illogical for Russia to use nuclear weapons for several reasons. One is that it wouldn't actually make a big difference on the battlefield because it's such a big country. Nuclear weapons would only affect sort of small areas unless they nuked a major city, which would be an extraordinary action to do. Furthermore, if Russia were to use nuclear weapons, every single country that's anywhere near Russia would rush to acquire its own nuclear weapons. So the risk to Russia itself would be enormously increased that other countries would use nuclear weapons against Russia. Extraordinarily, nuclear weapons have never been used since 1945, and it's another parallel between Japan and Ukraine. And any country that uses them now will lower the threshold massively and enormously increase the risk of them being used by others. There is something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is designed to discourage countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, I mean, at the risk of getting technical for a moment, in 1994, Ukraine had the third largest collection of nuclear weapons in the world. And the United Kingdom, United States, and Russia and Ukraine signed something called the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for a promise from those three countries that they would respect Ukraine's borders, would never threaten Ukraine, and would never exert economic pressure on Ukraine. Now, Russia has not exactly kept to that promise, and in a way, Russia's action, even in invading Ukraine in 2014, has put up a massive countrywide sized neon sign in huge letters saying, guys, you must never give up your nuclear weapons, because otherwise a country like Russia can just come and attack you and you can't do anything about it. And there's a debate about whether, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, it would actually be able to use them, if they would actually play a role. But I can guarantee you that President Putin would not be threatening all the time to use nuclear weapons if he knew that there were nuclear weapons inside Ukraine.
So certainly lots of lessons both to take from Fukushima to our current politics, and also from our current politics to take through to the future. I'm very conscious of time and wanting to preserve plenty of time for audience questions. I do, however, just want to ask one final question for the panel, which is that, of course, we've been talking today more about how our current situation influences our interaction with the memory of Fukushima. But I think another interesting theme that comes through in many people's writings and work is also how Fukushima, when it happened, was experienced and framed through the memory of other previous disasters. And I was wondering if anyone wanted to just say something briefly on that.
Well, I mean, in the context of the history of Japan and dealing with pollutants and the legacies of disaster, you have Minamata from the 1950s and 1960s. And particularly within where I come from, within a photography practice, work made there by Eugene W. Smith and Aileen Smith reflected massively on my approach when I came to making this piece of work in Fukushima. So I think there is. We live in an age now, maybe since the age of industrialization, where there's always a background sort of tension that any of us anywhere in the world could be exposed, or something could happen, as you were alluding to earlier. And of course, then when it does actually form itself into sort of kinetic moments. So I think, again, back to the sort of intangible, we're always living in a slightly intangible state, whether it's pandemic or the effects of climate change, or, so I think on that level, there's definitely a sort of, remembrance or synergy to linkage to Fukushima.
And there, we should say there is a lovely circularity in that, you've mentioned Eugene Smith and Eileen Smith's work and their influence on your own work. But Eileen Smith has also written an essay responding to one of Giles' pieces, which you can read in the exhibition space later.
Well, I guess in Japan, more than Minamata was actually Hiroshima, of course, and Nagasaki as very big radiation also tragedy, and also Chernobyl. And when I went to Fukushima and talked to people, they actually had established with Ukraine very good relationships, and they went and visited them like twice a year or something in school. So on a positive, to say something positive about it, also they had managed to actually forge very good relationship, and even after the war had started, so there was some connection, and they started to donate and become very alert and aware of what's going on in Ukraine, which wouldn't have been the case, I think, without the disaster experience. So.
All right. Well, I'm very conscious that people will have many, many questions for you all. So I think at this point we'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. Oh, we have one in the heavens.
Sorry, just 1 moment.
You can throw the mic.
No, that's okay. We'll send the mic up to you. But if there's
anyone
another
has a
question
down
here first, by the time we get up there. Yeah.
So, thank you very much, first of all. And then I have a question to Mr. Kawakubo. You're referring to the pace of journalism in contrast to the other communication forms, as, for example, art. So what do you think makes art different, contrary to other communication forms in our fast-paced society, as a means of communication after disaster? And can you break it down to certain characteristics? And could these be of use in future catastrophic scenarios? And additionally, is there a hidden layer of responsibility for artists?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting question because first, to answer the second part, is there a hidden responsibility to artists? I think basically it's the same to any member of society. So everyone is part of a society. When we're born, whether you want or not, we are we have this engagement. So in that sense, it's just a matter of how do you execute that feeling that you have inside yourself. And but at the same time, so if there is for example, there is a difference, for example, between for example, religion or religions and art might be that art or philosophy is whether you are looking for questions or you're looking for answers, I guess. So science as well is in search of both, perhaps. But I think it takes a lot of time to look for a question. It's sometimes easier to get to fabricate an answer because, well, for many reasons, I suppose, probably people know. But in that sense, I think for these reasons and as well for other more physical reasons, it takes time to make artworks. Well, with the advent of ChatGPT and this artificial intelligence, maybe artworks can be made in 10 seconds, but usually it takes a long time for physical reasons. For painters need to wait for the for the oil to dry and then apply a new layer, see it from different perspectives, think about it. So all these things take longer time than probably people would like to wait for as a report from an exclusion zone. So I think in that sense that people that are waiting for a fast and quick answer probably won't get that in art. So, but yeah, it keeps on going. So yeah, wonderful. I think.
No, and I mean, I think there's also something wonderful in the way that art can convene people and bring them back to reconsider events so many years afterwards, and to take time and to take stock in a way that does have a very different periodicity. Have we managed to run the microphone up?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I'd like to pose a question about the one thing that struck me about the pieces in the exhibition are how extraordinarily beautiful they all are, and part of me struggles with the tension between the relevance of the beautiful in relationship to the tragic, horrific scenes, the state that people were in. And I wonder what the responsibility of the artist is to, in any way, shape or form, reflect that in some way as a kind of tension over and above simply representing things beautifully as art is able to do very well indeed. Does that make sense as a question?
Absolutely. So something about the moral tension between the beauty of the work and the horror of the subject matter. And a question asked specifically of artists, but I think certainly one that Brigitte you can engage with in terms of academic writing, and Leigh you can also engage with in terms of your often very entertaining writing, but with such serious subject matter. Would anyone like to kick off?
I think there's a difference between, or particular in the context of the work that we both made in regards to Fukushima. There's a difference over the sort of kinetic, journalistic moment of something. Both of our pieces of work actually deal with sort of aftermath, and I think once things start to slow down, they become sort of forgotten, which is part of the problem with the legacy of most events, particularly in the age we live in now with the consumption and news cycles. And so I think that the sort of fetishization that can happen within the sort of shock and the awe detaches from sort of an art process, which is then about a consideration over time. And me personally, I fight that sort of tension. I make a type of practice where I don't set out from the start to make images that naturally fit into a sort of a beautification or from a starting point. Sometimes the work does, sometimes the work doesn't. But it's definitely something that I am conscious of when I approach subjects.
I think that's a very, very good point, because when I first saw my first film developed from the lab, that's what I thought. I felt it was like marvelously beautiful, and then the second after, I felt guilty of feeling beauty, and I tried to cancel that emotion, and then it created like a kind of tension or maybe struggle between these two, which left me wondering for a long time. It took me a long time to decide if I should or I should not publish that as an artwork, because you feel that maybe ethically it's not something right to kind of beautiful, or how to portray as something beautiful. But then one turn of the thinking after, also you can think that bringing attention or people's awareness into a marginalized discourse that might be becoming marginalized might be something beneficial. So maybe in a pragmatical way, maybe it's It's a guilt that you have to suffer in order to create another outcome. But then on a third turn, it's the beauty and the struggle between these, the contrast, it creates a structure similar to the Greek dramas or tragedies, where there is a protagonist. It's usually a beautiful young woman or man, and in the end, usually everybody dies. And then people in the theater feel sorrow and cries, and there is a kind of a climax, and then that creates a catharsis, and then people feel, well, like when we go to a cinema and feel and cry. But the danger of that is that it can make a sense of culmination, that is done, the story is done, it's the end, and that problem has been finished. And making works that create that kind of tension and beautify, or what do you say, beautify? Or, yeah. Can create that false sense of culmination, that the problem is over and there is a happy ending or a dramatic ending. So then probably there is a fourth turn and so on. But yeah, that was my point. Yeah, if it makes sense.
Thank you, Yoi. I mean, I do want to turn it over to our remaining two panelists. I mean, Brigitte, there's often not that much beauty in academic writing, but I think you are definitely an exception.
No, but this was my biggest challenge, actually, because I found it also disturbingly beautiful, because like these stars in the skies also are really beautiful, and the way I tried to respond to that was to juxtapose this with these responses about rubbish, about escape, that was very not beautiful, obviously. And so I hope that, having this juxtaposition of the excerpts from some narratives, obviously I couldn't write a whole book about this, but, well, I am writing a book about this, but not for this exhibition, so that hopefully deals a little bit with this. But yes, I found that was the biggest challenge, to respond to the pictures.
I mean, I'm very much reminded, as Yoi was saying, I'm reminded of ancient Greek drama, where, of course, we had these two faces, one smiling and one looking very dismayed. I was conscious I was sounding perhaps too optimistic earlier when I said there were lots of reasons why President Putin wouldn't use nuclear weapons, because it would be disastrous for Russia. But of course, everything President Putin has done since 2013 has been disastrous for Russia, including invading Ukraine in the first place in 2014, and then invading it again in 2022. So we can't rule it out. So there are some pretty dark clouds on the horizon. At the same time, I am fundamentally optimistic. I write a lot about this on my blog, Reasons to be Cheerful, and actually things are a lot better than you think. It always drives me mad when young people say, oh, I'm thinking we won't have children because the world is so awful. And it seems to me the world now is far better than it's ever been. We're healthier, we're living longer, the chances of our children dying in infancy are much smaller, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In my books, thank you very much kindly for mentioning them. I write thrillers mainly, and in these thrillers, as we were saying earlier, it's a safe place. We can go to the movies, we can read a book, we can see a piece of art, and we know that we will walk safely out of the gallery, probably. We will wake up in the morning after reading our thriller and we'll still be okay. But in the thriller, in the movie, terrible things are happening. And the fact that those terrible things are happening and we are okay makes us, as you were saying, it's a catharsis. We feel much better about it. And in particular, in the thrillers, somebody said of Blood Summit, which is, I tell you, a very bloodthirsty, it's not called Blood Summit for nothing, my Berlin thriller. It is rather dark. But somebody said it was the funniest thriller they'd ever read, because the heroine has a certain attitude to life which is quite amusing. And in 7 Hotel Stories, the heroine is a hotel general manager, I write the stories. Actually, every year I produce a new one for my girlfriend, who is a hotel general manager, and I've got to write a new one by July. And she does not put up with men behaving badly in hotels. Right? I mean, if you go to hotels, I hear a lot of stories about what goes on in hotels. You wouldn't believe how badly men behave in hotels. And Ms. N, the heroine, will not accept this. So men who behave badly will be punished. And some of them, we may never hear from them again. And that kind of black humor, I think, helps us to cope with a world where things are just wrong. You know, where not only on the macro scale we've been talking about, the future of humankind is at risk, but also on the micro scale, our relationships are shit. You know, this person has treated me badly, all those things. And we've got to just get through with it. And I think that art and fiction and the kind of thing we have in this exhibition really helps us with that, and we should treasure it.
So I can promise that all visitors to my exhibitions do leave safely. I'm not Mr. M. But I think that's a wonderful note on which to bring this discussion to a close. I do encourage people to read Reasons to be Cheerful, to check out Brigitte's ethnography of the 2011 you were doing the ethnography? Yes. Of the tsunami evacuation shelters. And of course, you'll all now have the opportunity to engage with Giles and Yoi's work in the exhibition. I hope you'll join me in thanking all our panelists. All right. Well, without any further ado, shall we head over to the Hyong Gallery?
Don't forget to...